Hi everyone! Welcome to your first lecture of the semester. This is going to be Introduction to Autoethnography as an Artistic Research Method. I'm going to go over the basics of autoethnography as a research method, give you a little bit of the history and why we do this kind of research, and also give you a little bit of a preview of what the semester will entail before you begin the readings and get into the syllabus. First, it's important to understand where autoethnography falls on our spectrum of social scientific research. The idea of research as we know it today didn't really begin until the early 1700s during the Enlightenment, and this idea that we could have systematic inquiry of the world around us. This started with the natural sciences. If you think back to 7th grade when you were doing different sorts of experiments in your science class and you had a research method where you tested a hypothesis, that all goes back to that Enlightenment systematic inquiry. Now, we also do this in social science, and it's this idea of a post-positivist perspective, because at first social sciences thought that maybe they could predict human behavior as well as they could predict how atoms would move, but they found that they really can't, that we're a little bit harder to know what we'll do. We're just not always rational. We don't always do what we think we don't even do what we think we would do, never mind what someone else would think we would do. And that's where post-positivism comes from, this idea that we can't know for sure what every person will do, but we can predict what large groups can do. And such large percentages of the population will do this, enough that we can say this is a sound research finding. And this went on for centuries, until we get to the 1900s, and when phenomenology and interpretivism, and then critical analysis later began. And this was this idea that there was no capital T truth about human behavior that we can find, that knowledge, that action, identity, and behavior is all tied to this idea of the bodies we're in and the cultural location that body happens to be and the power structures that surround it. A good example of this is when we think about gender roles and this idea that while some of that might be biologically determined by the chemicals within our bodies, that overall we know that if society categorizes us as male, there is a lot of things we're supposed to do as males, and we learn how to do and perform what it means to be masculine. Or if we're born and characterized as a girl, there are ideas of here's what you need to do to be feminine. And if we don't do those things, if we push back against that, what happens is that we risk social ostracization. We risk not getting opportunities we would get if we performed within those power structures. And this goes with the idea of social class. This goes with the idea of what a good worker in a capitalist society should be. And all of this idea of these identities that are layered within us, that we do understand social expectations and that there are consequences when we deviate from those. So in this way, we have these bodies who have knowledge of what it means to move through the world, situated in the cultural location and the bodies we're in. And when we tell our stories, we can exchange that knowledge across bodies and get a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. We also can look at themes. We can see that bodies that are categorized in similar ways in similar cultural locations often have similar experiences. A good example of this is my most recent study that was looking at people who live with seizure disorders. And these people living with seizure disorders, I found there was different things that they shared. One was the struggle over medicine, of whether or not they wanted to experience the side effects that medicine had, whether or not they could handle the expense of medicine, whether they wanted to handle the social stigma of being on a brain medication that wasn't only used to control seizures, but also for different kinds of mental illness that they were worried of being stigmatized if people thought they had these different illnesses. And this happened across the narratives enough that I can say, with a similar body in a similar location, there are these shared experiences. So that's this idea that really the stories of the bodies that have lived the experience are authorities. And with reflection and careful analysis, we can learn about culture through these bodies. Okay, now we also want to know a little bit of, we have autoethnography, and we need to know a little bit about classic ethnography, because that's where autoethnography comes from. Now, classic ethnography emerges from anthropology, but it crosses into many social science departments. And there's this idea that there's this detached observer. There is this person that is going to go out into a culture that they know nothing about. Often it was to the depths of Africa, and they're going to watch that culture. And they're going to be far enough away, observing from a distance, that they can be objective. And they can tell everyone about this culture, things that the people actually living it maybe don't know. Because of this idea, as this detached observer, they would know more. Now, critical ethnography didn't emerge until the 1990s, and it was a man named Dwight Conquergood in the Communication Studies Department at Northwestern University in Chicago. And he said, I don't think I need to go to another country to learn about cultures. I think there's a lot I can learn about cultures right here in Chicago. So what he did was he rented a room in an infamous subsidized housing complex where people were thought to be dangerous. They were thought to be helpless in a lot of ways. They were thought to be angry. They were thought to be unreachable. And he says, I'm going to live with them, and I'm going to learn about what it means to be part of this group. And he did, and he became emotionally invested, and he wanted to help them. He wanted to advocate for them. He wanted to get them more resources. He didn't want to be a detached observer there to understand. He wanted to be a participant in their culture and a researcher there for advocacy. So this idea of what we want to guard against, he said, when we're in these spaces, we need to realize that we're not exploiting people in order to say, I'm going to say the most shocking thing I found to try to really get a reaction out of people. That I'm not going to sensationalize it. I'm not going to make it bigger than it is just so it becomes a good story. I'm not going to simplify them and make them seem like they're all alike so that I can say I have this overarching theory that applies to all people. And I'm not going to withdraw. I'm not going to decide, you know what, they're just so unknowable that I'm not even going to try to reach them, right? So this is what we need to do as we work with one another. And just like Dwight Conquergood did this with his participants, it's important to think about doing this a little bit with the characters in the story we tell, to take a moment to think about what were they feeling? What were they thinking? And be able to relate back and forth and start thinking and empathizing and understanding different positions within the stories we tell ourselves. Okay, let me just break down the primary word for you of this entire course, autoethnography. Auto is the self, just like autobiography. Ethno means culture, and then graphy means study. So it is a study of self to understand culture and relationships to others. So that is the foundational reason why we call what we're doing autoethnography. Essentially, it is the study of culture through one's own story. The autoethnographer gazes back and forth at themselves and at culture, seeing the struggle to create, perpetuate, and resist meanings with others. There is this idea that we're merging art and social science. We're merging strong, accessible writing with rigorous cultural analysis. So this idea that we aren't just telling our story, because it's okay as someone in creative writing to tell a story as you experienced it, and not attune a whole lot to that culture or have a message of social change. Sometimes we tell stories just for the sake of telling, and that's telling a story, but it's not autoethnography. What comes with autoethnography is we're looking at ourselves, our bodies that experience something in a social location, where people read our body as belonging to an identity group, and our relationship to them. And so we're looking, what can we learn about culture through the identities, through the bodies that were located in this cultural space during the moment this happened. So this idea of part of how we do this rigorous type of work is self-reflexivity, and that's turning creative writing into research. One thing to really emphasize is we are thinking about our personal location. What was that experience? The social implications of relating to other people, and the culture we're in. We all belong to many identity groups: gender, sexuality, race, class, size. All of these matter. And you have more. You have your religious groups. You have the social groups that you're a part of. All of these form who we are, how we relate and interpret to others, and how they relate and interpret to them. And to know none of these identities are value neutral. They come with privileges. They come with marginalities. Know that in this context, privilege and marginalities aren't things that we earn through our behavior. They are simply granted to us or pressed upon us because of how others read our body. I'll give you an example. I write a lot about being disabled. You're going to read my book, the first chapter of it, that talks about my experiences of people reading my cerebral palsied body. And in those moments, there's marginalizations that happen, where people assume things about my ability, they assume things about my intellect, they assume things about what sort of opportunities I should be able to have based on their perception of what I can do and not do. In that way, there's marginalization. But there is also privileges that I have. I'm white. I have a stable job and income. I have a lot of education. I have a PhD. And in that way, I have these privileges. I'm also a straight woman. That gives me privileges that go with that go against the idea that I live just a marginalized life. Most of us live this very multifaceted identity that intersects with different aspects of culture. In some ways we're privileged, in some ways we're marginalized, and one doesn't negate the others. It means simply that we have advantages and we have some disadvantages. The fact that I am white doesn't mean that I have never experienced any marginalization. It just means I haven't experienced marginalization that comes from from my race and from how people perceive my color. So those are things to be thinking about where are your privileges, where are your marginalities, and how do they interplay in these stories you tell based on the prompts that I give you. So why do we do this kind of work? Part of it is accessibility. More people will engage with a story in a deeper, meaningful ways than they will if you just give them a research article with a lot of theory and statistics. It's a way for people that are not in the academy, that don't have a high education level, to still learn about identity, about culture, about power and privilege. Stories reach people. They're accessible. There's also empathy. When there is this experience that's tied to a body that we can relate to, that person's story becomes part of our own. We feel like we know them. Think of characters that you've read about that you think back to, that you know them. And you relate them when something happens that reminds you of them. And that happens in deeper ways with a personal story than maybe with a theory that we heard and we understood, but we didn't fold into who we are. We do it for social change, because if enough people hear stories and change how they think about things, then they start interacting different. They start understanding different. They start making different kinds of decisions. They start prioritizing different kinds of things. One thing, they might start voting different in a political election because now they have a little bit more intimate knowledge of who this particular law is actually going to affect. And so this is the idea of why we do this. We want a story that people can identify with, fold into who they are, and then act in more humane, just, inclusive ways because of it. For this particular unit, you are going to be reading 4 different texts. You're going to look at the first and second chapter of Tony Adams, Stacey Holman Jones, and Carolyn Ellis's book on autoethnography. It's going to give you an overarching idea of why people do autoethnography, how they come to it, and the basics of what makes good autoethnographic writing. You're going to also read my text. This was going to focus on how stories help us understand identity and to map through what makes a story reach people and why we react to them the way we do. So I'm excited for you to read that work as well. Carolyn Ellis, I'm having you read Carolyn's book because it's just one chapter of her book, because I really love how she creates a graduate seminar classroom that's taking place in person. It's different than our classroom, but it talks about all the different ways we use autoethnography in research. So you can have a broader understanding of it as a social science and as an artistic research method. She's also considered the grandmother of autoethnography. Her and her husband Art were some of the first people to start doing this work. I'm also going to have you read Craig Gingrich Philbrook. He's one of my favorite theorists, one of my favorite performance artists as well. And he's someone who has been telling his stories for a long time on both the page and the stage. And he tells us what we need to worry about, how we need to make sure we're doing autoethnography well. So I recommend that you read these books in this order. Start with Tony, Stacey, and Carolyn for this overview. Go to my book to really start looking at stories in depth. Go into Carolyn's book to see the overarching way that these stories materialize in research methods. And then go to Craig's to know what you should watch out for and to make sure that your writing is good and that it's rigorous and that it's ethical. Just to remind you of what is due, you're going to create an introductory statement once you read the syllabus and an infographic for the course. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to give you one reading that you're going to make an infographic for. I will have that for you up in your announcements, and you'll know which of the readings you're making an infographic for. Now, you're going to, of course, read all of them. So you're going to then respond with a quote that stood out to you from each of those readings and why you think that's important, either to understanding autoethnography as a method or understanding the identity of the people you were reading. And I want you to be being mindful of, remember, we can always return to this foundational discussion that we're creating to help us create our artist statements, which is the analysis of the stories we decide to tell that accompanies each of the different projects we do in this unit. So this is an archive of all of the important quotes that you found to jog your memories as you're going back to craft these statements, because you will need to cite at least 2 readings, and this will be a good archive for where to do that. So when you're going to create an infographic. If you're not sure what an infographic is, don't worry. It's a visual representation of content. So instead of having you write a summary, you're going to create a visual diagram of these stories. You're going to go to the website Canva, which is different than Canvas, where this lecture is taking place. I have that link for you right in the assignment, and they have all these templates that you can choose from. So you'll choose a template, and then you will choose colors that you feel reflect the reading. There's choices for different graphics, and you'll pull key pieces that you think are important of how would we summarize and communicate what this reading offers us to what it means to do autoethnography well, what it means to tell stories for critical cultural analysis well. And so you'll make those, you will post them to the Canvas discussion board, and then you will comment on the ones that you did not create, adding another quote and the reason why you think that's important. So I'm excited for you to do that. So when all of that is ready, we will move on to the next unit. So I will see you soon for your next lecture. And between now and then, know that you can always call me. You can always contact me also through the mechanisms of our video work. You can look at that syllabus of how we can have a face-to-face conversation as well. If you're local, I would love to see you during office hours or set up an appointment. And always, if you call my cell, you know I'll answer. So I'll see you soon. Bye.